the Gemini Lounge was a notorious mob-operated bar in Brooklyn, New York. It became infamous in the 1970s and 1980s as a site for numerous hits. The DeMeo crew headed by the serial killer Roy DeMeo ruled Flatlands through brutal fear and terror. The hits that happened there were orchestrated with the Gemini method: lure the victim into the side apartment to the bar, and as they walked along the narrow corridor a member of the DeMeo crew would jump out and fire into the victim's head. To minimize the blood flow, another member would wrap the head in towels and pierce the victim's heart to stop the blood pumping. The crew would then string the victim upside down over a bathtub until the blood was fully drained. The person would then be dismembered, packaged, and deposited in various dumpsters so that the victim could not be identified. The murders at the Gemini Lounge are considered part of the broader story of the DeMeo crew, which is believed to have been responsible for more than 100 murders during the 1970s and 1980s. Anthony Center and Joseph Testa, infamously known as the Gemini Twins, carved their names into the dark annals of the Gambino and Lucchese crime families. Their journey began in the shadows of Brooklyn's streets, intertwined with the notorious Roy DeMeo crew. Center's roots traced back to Canarsie, Brooklyn, where he was born to immigrant parents from Italy. His familial ties to the criminal world were evident, with an uncle entrenched in Gambino and Colombo circles. Meanwhile, Testa hailed from a large family, his path converging with Center's through a shared penchant for violence and camaraderie. Their bond forged in the crucible of Brooklyn's mean streets. Center and Testa earned their moniker, the Gemini Twins, for their inseparable alliance. Their association with the DeMeo crew solidified their place in the criminal hierarchy, with their hangout at the Gemini Lounge becoming synonymous with danger and deceit. Under the tutelage of Roy DeMeo, Center and Testa honed their skills, becoming integral members of the crew known for its brutal efficiency. The DeMeo crew's reign of terror stretched across decades, with a laundry list of murders attributed to their name. The twins took part in the Gemini method, luring unsuspecting victims to the Gemini Lounge and ambushing the victim with an ice-cold brutality. However, internal tensions simmered within the crew. Center's contentious relationship with Albert DeMeo, Roy's son, highlighted the rifts that threatened to tear the crew apart. And when Roy DeMeo met a grisly end, suspicions of betrayal and revenge hung heavy in the air. DeMeo's hit was believed to have been carried out by his own men and capo Nino Gaggi. The demise of Roy DeMeo marked a turning point for Center and Testa due to their notorious reputation. The Lucchese crime family under boss Anthony Casso embraced them into the already ultra-violent family. The pair carried on with hits for their family, most noticeably being linked with the Reznikov hit. In 1989, Center and Testa were both sentenced to life imprisonment for crimes that include multiple murders. In June 2022, Center was granted parole. He was transferred to a halfway house in New York in December 2023. Testa was paroled on April 30, 2024. The legacy of the Gemini twins looms large. Whether redemption or a further descent into darkness awaits them remains to be seen.
Anthony Center and Joseph Testa, infamously known as the Gemini Twins, are notorious mobsters associated with the Lucchese crime family. Before their affiliation with the Lucchese organization, they were prominent members of the DeMeo crew, a violent faction within the Gambino crime family. Their criminal activities caught up with them in 1989 when both were convicted of racketeering and a staggering 10 counts of murder. As a result, they received life sentences in federal prison, marking the end of their reign of terror. Anthony Michael Center was born in the Canarsie neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York, into a family of Italian immigrants. His father, Michael Center, hailed from northern Italy, while his mother originated from Rovereto, a small town in the Italian Alps. The family name was originally Cente, reflecting its Italian heritage, but it was later anglicized to Center to assimilate into American society. Center's uncle, Robert Center, was a known associate of both the Gambino and Colombo crime families and owned the Canarsie Recycling Company, a business that became a hub for criminal connections. As a young man, Anthony juggled work between his father's modest debris removal business and his uncle's more lucrative sanitation company, gaining early exposure to the criminal underworld. On July 24, 1977, Anthony Center married an Italian-American woman in a grand ceremony held at a catering hall in Canarsie. The wedding was a notable affair, attended by several figures from organized crime, including Roy DeMeo, a high-ranking member of the Gambino crime family. This event solidified Center's ties to the underworld and further entrenched him in a life of crime. Joseph Carmine Testa was born in 1955 in the United States. Testa was one of 9 children born to a transport truck driver and a housewife. His brother, Patrick Testa, also became a mobster, joining the DeMeo crew. Growing up, Anthony Center became close friends with Joseph Testa. When Testa was 15, a 13-year-old neighbor was mugged by a knife-wielding Puerto Rican man from East New York. The assault victim complained to Testa, who gathered Center among others and led the group in a borrowed car, spending the day searching for the assailant. In 1973, Testa was nearly killed in a bar fight with a Puerto Rican opponent when the assailant's knife punctured his lung. Center hunted down the Puerto Rican and nearly beat him to death with his fists. By 1970, just 15 years old, Joseph Center had already racked up 3 auto theft convictions, showcasing an early knack for crime. However, because he was still a juvenile, the legal system dismissed all his charges. Around the same time, Center forged a close partnership with Anthony Testa, a bond so tight that the two became inseparable and earned the nickname Gemini Twins. The moniker not only reflected their constant companionship, but also tied them to the infamous Gemini Lounge, the central gathering spot for the notorious DeMeo crew. Their rise in the criminal underworld began when Chris Rosenberg, a trusted associate of Roy DeMeo, hired Center and Testa for odd jobs, detailing his Corvette and Porsche and stealing cars. Rosenberg later introduced the duo to Roy DeMeo himself, who saw potential in their talents and invited them to join his growing crew. Alongside DeMeo and Rosenberg, Center and Testa became integral members of the DeMeo crew, a group that gained infamy for their brutal methods and a staggering body count. Over the mid-1970s and into the 1980s, the crew was suspected of committing anywhere from 75 to 200 murders, cementing their place in criminal history. Center, in particular, played a key role in the crew's success, generating substantial revenue through auto theft operations. Despite his contributions, Center was not universally liked. Albert DeMeo, Roy's son, harbored a personal disdain for him, remarking that there was something slick and phony about Center that he couldn't trust. On April 19, 1979, a chilling incident unfolded when Roy DeMeo, a notorious figure in organized crime, mistakenly identified college student Dominic Rigucci as a Cuban hitman. Acting on this fatal misjudgment, DeMeo executed Rigucci in a public display of violence, sending shockwaves through the community. The aftermath of the murder forced DeMeo's crew into hiding. Members Joseph Testa and Anthony Center fled to California seeking refuge from the chaos that ensued. Following the murder of fellow crew member Chris Rosenberg, Joseph Testa rose to prominence as DeMeo's trusted right-hand man, a position previously held by Rosenberg. The dynamics within the crew shifted as tensions mounted, foreshadowing darker days ahead. Fast forward to January 10, 1983, when Roy DeMeo attended a meeting with his associates at Patrick Testa Motors Inc., a body shop in Canarsie, Brooklyn, owned by crew member Patrick Testa. 10 days later, on January 20th, the ominous fate of Roy DeMeo was revealed. His lifeless body was discovered in the trunk of his Cadillac Coupe de Ville, abandoned in the Varuna Boat Club parking lot. A chandelier rested atop his corpse, a macabre detail that only deepened the mystery surrounding his death. DeMeo had been shot multiple times in the head, and a bullet wound in his hand suggested he had instinctively tried to shield himself from the fatal gunfire. Law enforcement initially suspected Anthony Gaggi, a known associate, as the mastermind behind the killing. However, no charges were ever brought against him, leaving DeMeo's murder shrouded in speculation and unanswered questions. Former Lucchese acting boss Anthony Casso claimed that Roy DeMeo met his end at the Canarsie home of Patrick Testa, orchestrated by Joseph Testa and Anthony Center. According to Casso, the hit was carried out under a contract issued by Gambino crime family boss Paul Castellano and his underboss, Frank DeSico. After failed attempts to eliminate DeMeo in the fall of 1982, Castellano and DeSico turned to Casso, who agreed to facilitate the murder. DeMeo, seated and moments away from being served coffee, was ambushed as Testa and Center opened fire. Notably, Anthony Gaggi, one of DeMeo's closest associates, was absent during the incident. Sammy the Bull Gravano later revealed that Castellano had grown increasingly alarmed by DeMeo and his crew, who had descended into a ruthless killing spree that tarnished the Gambino family's reputation. Castellano, determined to clean house, ordered Frank DeSico to eliminate the entire DeMeo crew. However, recognizing the near-impossible nature of such a task, DeSico devised an alternative plan. He approached the Gemini twins, Joseph Testa and Anthony Center, informed them of the hit on their crew, and offered them a lifeline. They could avoid their own demise if they turned on DeMeo and carried out the murder themselves. This brutal deal sealed DeMeo's fate, ending the reign of one of the most feared figures in the New York underworld. After the assassination of Roy DeMeo, the Gambino family upheld their promise to spare the lives of Joseph Testa and Anthony Center. However, the family refused to formally induct them, viewing their continued association as a liability. This decision led to their eventual alignment with Anthony Casso and the Lucchese crime family. Casso later implicated Center and Testa in the high-profile killing of Vladimir Reznikov on June 13, 1986. Reznikov, a Russian-American gangster, had reportedly made death threats against Marat Balagula, a Ukrainian immigrant who was a dominant figure in the Russian Mafia of Brighton Beach. Balagula was not only a powerful underworld figure but also a mastermind behind a lucrative multi-million-dollar gasoline bootlegging scheme. His operation had become a significant source of income for the five families, second only to drug trafficking. The murder of Reznikov, carried out at Balagula's behest, eliminated a critical threat to his empire and reinforced his alliance with organized crime in New York. Later that same year, Center and Testa faced legal troubles unrelated to the Reznikov case. They stood trial for conspiracy to transport stolen vehicles and were also accused of murder. While the jury acquitted them of the conspiracy charges, they failed to reach a unanimous decision on the murder allegations, leaving the case unresolved. Their complex criminal activities continued to solidify their reputation as ruthless operatives within the world of organized crime. On September 14, 1989, Thomas Center and Anthony Testa received life sentences for their involvement in a series of heinous crimes, including multiple murders. Center was incarcerated at the United States Penitentiary in Allenwood, Pennsylvania, while Testa served his sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution on Terminal Island. Their imprisonment, however, did not mark the end of controversy surrounding their activities. In 1994, an unusual discovery came to light involving Center's cousin Dominic Vulpes, who owned a garbage disposal company. Vulpes uncovered that pension contributions had been made to a Teamsters pension account under Center's name, despite Center serving a life sentence in federal prison. A subsequent investigation revealed that over $30,000 had been deposited into the account over 6 years. If these payments from Canarsie Recycling had continued for another 5 years, Center would have been eligible for a monthly pension of $1,400. However, the Teamsters Union disqualified Center as a member, and the pension fund rejected his claim, ensuring he would not benefit from the fraudulent contributions. The details surrounding whether Vulpes or his company received a refund for these payments remain unclear. Years later, in a surprising turn of events, the United States Parole Commission granted Center parole on June 22, 2022, with his release scheduled for June 22, 2024. In December 2023, Center was transferred to a halfway house in New York to prepare for his reintegration into society. Meanwhile, in February 2024, the Parole Commission ordered Testa's release, and he was officially paroled on April 30, 2024, concluding decades of incarceration for both men. Center and Testa were integral to the DeMeo crew's operations and were directly involved in countless murders. The crew is estimated to have killed over 100 people, with Center and Testa often playing key roles in the Gemini method, a systematic way of killing and disposing of victims to avoid detection. Their efficiency and brutality set a standard for organized crime enforcement. They showed how violence and fear could be used to maintain control, settle disputes, and silence threats within the Mafia's ranks. The duo and the DeMeo crew symbolized the extreme lengths to which organized crime groups went during the Mafia's peak years in the United States. Their actions contributed to the public's fear of the Mafia and led to intensified law enforcement efforts to dismantle organized crime families. After the dismantling of the DeMeo crew in the early 1980s, largely due to law enforcement pressure and internal betrayal, Center and Testa were arrested and convicted. In 1989, both were sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Their downfall highlighted the inevitable collapse of even the most feared mafia figures when faced with relentless government scrutiny. The legacy of Anthony Center and Joseph Testa remains as a grim reminder of the violent nature of organized crime during the late 20th century. They contributed to the mafia's decline by attracting intense law enforcement attention due to their brutality. While their actions strengthened the mafia's grip in the short term, they also hastened its downfall by exposing its vulnerabilities and internal chaos. The Gemini twins remain infamous figures in the history of the American mafia, representing both its power and its eventual unraveling.
When I would clean his car and stuff, I would find a gun in the car, I'd find disguises in there, and it really kind of conflicted me. It made me question it more. So, one day I had a fight with a kid in school, and I got suspended, so my father had to pick me up, and he said, "What happened? Why'd you get suspended from school?" And I said, "Well, we had a fight, and he said, "Well, all right, you did the right thing, you defended yourself, just, try not to get in trouble in school." And I turned to my father, and I said, "Well, what's the worst thing that you ever did to somebody?" And my father he looked at me, and then he looked down, and he said, "Someday you'll know, someday you'll know." And I basically kind of got like a knot in my stomach, because while it opened my eyes a little bit, because I could speculate on what he meant by that, it just filled me with a lot more of questions. My father had a stolen car operation, and he was very meticulous about how he wanted things done, and people had to wear gloves not to get fingerprints on things, and as time went on and it got more successful, people got sloppy and they didn't listen to him, and eventually people got arrested, and it brought heat down on the entire family. So my father, being the boss of that operation, had to be responsible for that. So he had to take the blame for what happened and the convictions, because it was bringing heat. It's always your best friends that kill you in that line of work. So they'll probably invite you to dinner, you'll sit down, you might even eat your dinner, and then they'll shoot you in the head. I was having birthday cake with my sister. We waited. We didn't have the cake. We waited for my father to come home. It was her birthday. And all of a sudden the doorbell rang. I walked to the door, and there was just probably 30 or 40 police officers, guys in suits, just all kinds of law enforcement at the door. And I answered the door, and they basically said, "Howard DeMeo?" I said, "Yes." And they said, "Your father's been killed." And basically that was it. Your father's was found in the trunk of his car. That was it. That's the way they told me. But as far as myself, I was prepared for it. They were devastated. Everybody was crushed. My sisters, my mother. I knew it was coming. He told me the night before that he was going to be killed the next day. The way he looked at it, he built. We had a nice life. We were all college bound. We all had done well in school, and that's what he wanted for his family. He didn't want the kind of life that he led. So basically, he saw it as if he ran, we would have took the heat. We would have been destroyed. So he opted to go and be destroyed himself, so we could live on. And that is why he did it. He had an office in the house, and I would sit down, we'd talk about various things. And this one night I went in, I sat down, and he just threw the question out at me. He says, "What are you going to do if I'm dead?" I said, "What am I going to do?" I said, "I'm going to find the guys that did it to you, and I'm going to go kill them." And he said, and my father never yelled at me, and he never hit me in my life. And he got up, he walked around his desk, and he grabbed me, and he basically yelled at me. He goes, "No, you won't." He goes, "You'll forget me, you'll bury me, and that'll be the end of it." And that was it. He said, tomorrow I'm not coming home, basically. So Yeah. I thought because we had planned an escape route for him if the heat came down, if the law enforcement got close to him. We had plenty of escape routes, safe houses set up, places where he could go. So I kind of deep down I felt, okay, he wants me to be believable when they question me if he's really gone. So he's telling me that he's gonna be dead tomorrow. So I kind of like tricked myself into not believing what he was saying to me. Because I knew that we had all these other plans. And the next morning, I kissed him goodbye before I left for school. And as I did all the time, because deep in the back of my mind, I always felt that I would never see him again. That's why I always did that. And that was it. I never saw him again.
Harvey Chris Rosenberg, born on October 6, 1950, and tragically killed on May 11, 1979, was a notorious figure in the world of organized crime. Known by aliases such as Chris DeMeo and Christopher Rosalia, Rosenberg was a pivotal member of the DeMeo crew, a ruthless faction within the Gambino crime family led by the feared Roy DeMeo. This crew gained infamy during the mid-1970s to early 1980s, being linked to an astonishing 75 to 200 murders, cementing their legacy as one of the most brutal groups in Mafia history. Rosenberg was raised in Canarsie, Brooklyn, a predominantly Italian-American neighborhood where the influence of the Mafia was deeply rooted. He attended Samuel J. Tilden High School in East Flatbush, and while he was of Jewish descent, Rosenberg harbored aspirations of becoming a made man in the Mafia, a status traditionally reserved for full-blooded Italians. His ambitions were driven by his reputation for being a skilled earner and his willingness to engage in violence to prove his loyalty and worth. Uncomfortable with his Jewish heritage being a potential barrier, Rosenberg distanced himself from his last name and encouraged others to address him as Chris DeMeo. His criminal career came to a grim end after he stole from a Cuban drug cartel during a failed narcotics deal. To settle the deadly dispute and prevent further retribution, his mentor, Roy DeMeo, executed him in an act of restitution. Rosenberg's story remains a chilling chapter in the annals of organized crime, a testament to the treacherous world he embraced. Rosenberg's journey into crime began alarmingly early. At just 13 years old, he started selling marijuana, which laid the foundation for a life entrenched in illegal activities. His first brush with the law came in 1970 when he was arrested for car theft. Initially charged as a felony, the case was later reduced to a misdemeanor, sparing him jail time and resulting in probation instead. This marked the beginning of a series of arrests. In 1971, he was detained for possessing hashish, and in 1972, he faced charges for attempting to steal a snowplow. However, both cases were eventually dismissed. During his early ventures into the drug trade, Rosenberg was dealing small quantities of marijuana and hashish when fate led him to cross paths with Roy DeMeo at a gas station in Canarsie in 1966. DeMeo saw potential in the young Rosenberg, enlisting him to steal cars that could be offloaded through DeMeo's network of Canarsie junkyards. Beyond their business dealings, Rosenberg became the first crew member to form a social bond with DeMeo, regularly attending family barbecues and gatherings at his home. With a knack for cars and an expanding drug operation, Rosenberg soon established himself as a notable figure in the criminal underworld. By 1972, he owned and operated Carphobia Repairs, a garage that covertly became a hub for stolen vehicles. Recruiting friends to assist in the trade, he introduced Joseph Testa and Anthony Center, known as the Gemini twins, to DeMeo. These two, lifelong friends of Rosenberg and full-blooded Italians, became integral members of the DeMeo crew, cementing Rosenberg's pivotal role in their criminal empire. By 1974, Chris Rosenberg, just 23 years old, had delved deeper into the drug trade, selling cocaine and quaaludes under the backing of his mentor, Roy DeMeo. His operation was made possible through a pharmacist connection who provided both the quaaludes and medical-grade cocaine, substances that could still be legally prescribed at the time. Through this pharmacist, Rosenberg and the burgeoning DeMeo crew crossed paths with 22-year-old Andre Katz, a man who would later become their likely first murder victim. The trouble began when Katz was arrested for possessing a stolen car he had unknowingly purchased from the crew. Feeling betrayed, Katz pointed the finger at Rosenberg, sparking a chain of events that quickly spiraled into violence. Shortly after, Katz was ambushed, dragged from his vehicle, and beaten so severely by two men that he ended up hospitalized. During his recovery, Katz confided in his brother Victor, naming Joseph Testa and Anthony Center as his attackers. He also vowed to seek revenge against Rosenberg and his associates. That revenge materialized on November 13, 1974, when Rosenberg opened his garage door and was ambushed by a gunman wielding an automatic rifle. Rosenberg survived through sheer luck, one bullet hitting him in the lower jaw, another his right arm, and a third that was aimed for his chest, merely glancing off. Surviving what should have been a fatal shooting, Rosenberg was reportedly furious. His jaw was left disfigured from the bullet wound. Despite undergoing reconstructive surgery, from that point on, Rosenberg wore a beard to mask the scars that resulted from this attack. The man responsible for shooting Rosenberg that fateful morning vanished without a trace, but suspicion immediately fell on Andre Katz. Both Rosenberg and the rest of the DeMeo crew believed Katz to be the assailant. While Rosenberg was still in the hospital recovering from his gunshot wounds, the crew, led by Roy DeMeo, convened to address the escalating violence. They unanimously agreed that Katz's actions could not go unanswered. His fate was sealed. Katz had to be eliminated. However, the crew recognized the risks of taking direct action against Katz, especially given the recent volatility. Henry Borelli, a newer addition to the crew who had joined shortly after Rosenberg was attacked, proposed an alternative. Borelli suggested using a female acquaintance to lure Katz into a trap. The plan was simple, yet chilling in its precision. Under the guise of a date, the woman would invite Katz to her apartment complex, where he would unknowingly walk into the crew's clutches. On Friday, June 13, 1975, Katz arrived at the predetermined location expecting an evening of romance. Instead, he was ambushed by Rosenberg, Borelli, Joseph Testa, and Anthony Center. They abducted him and transported him to the meat department of a local grocery store, where DeMeo awaited their arrival. The DeMeo crew is first known to have been involved with murder and dismemberment. While first-hand accounts of the incident are unavailable, information provided by crew members who cooperated with the government years later, as well as the actual remains of Andre Katz, provided clues that were used by law enforcement, as well as author Jerry Capecci, to reconstruct the events. Katz was stabbed multiple times in the heart with a butcher knife, presumably by Rosenberg in revenge for the shooting that had ruined his face. Long after Katz had been killed, his body endured a gruesome post-mortem attack, with over a dozen stab wounds inflicted on his back. It was widely believed that Rosenberg committed this macabre act. The brutality didn't end there. Katz's lifeless body was stripped of clothing and systematically dismembered. DeMeo and Testa, both former butcher apprentices, were suspected of carrying out this part of the horrific task. The corpse was then decapitated, and in a shocking turn, one of the men, thought to be Rosenberg, used an industrial machine designed to crush cardboard boxes to obliterate Katz's head. The extent of the damage to the remains was so severe that dental records became the only means of positively identifying Katz. Henry Borelli's female associate, upon learning of Katz's gruesome fate, admitted her involvement but was unable to definitively identify Rosenberg. Despite her confession, the authorities managed to apprehend Borelli and Testa. The two faced lengthy pretrial detentions, but were ultimately acquitted in January 1976. Yet, the specter of Katz's murder continued to loom over the DeMeo crew for years. By the late 1980s, a federal and state task force zeroed in on the crew's activities, reopening old wounds from the case. Dominic Montiglio, the nephew of Anthony Gaggi, a high-ranking member of the Gambino family, later revealed in court that Rosenberg had confided in him about the murder. He also testified that Rosenberg claimed Katz's murder had driven DeMeo and his crew to decide that any future conflicts would be settled in a similar manner of dismemberment to make the victim disappear. During the late 1970s, the DeMeo crew, led by Roy DeMeo, became infamous for a brutal killing spree that claimed numerous lives. These murders targeted suspected informants and rival mobsters, often as part of contracts carried out by the crew. Dominic Montiglio, who frequently visited the Gemini Lounge to collect payments on behalf of Anthony Gaggi, later revealed a chilling detail in an interview. The crew's sense of purpose and morale was so deeply tied to their violent activities that failing to kill at least 3 people a week left them feeling dejected. While some victims were brazenly shot and left in public to send a message, most killings followed the crew's notorious Gemini method. Named after their primary headquarters, the Gemini Lounge, this method was designed to efficiently dispose of bodies while minimizing evidence. Victims were lured to an apartment behind the lounge, ominously referred to as the clubhouse by crew members. According to government witness Frederick DeMeo, Roy DeMeo himself typically initiated the killings by approaching the victim with a silenced pistol and delivering a fatal shot to the head. A towel would then be wrapped around the wound to prevent blood from spilling. Immediately after, another crew member would stab the victim in the heart, halting further blood circulation. Once the victim was dead, the body was dragged to a bathtub and suspended above it to allow the remaining blood to drain and congeal, reducing the mess during dismemberment. This was done so that the corpse would bleed out and the remaining blood would congeal, making the following step, the dismemberment of the victim, as clean as possible. The body parts would be put into bags, boxed, and then sent off to Brooklyn's Fountain Avenue dump, among other places. Witness testimonies from former crew members paint a chilling picture of Rosenberg's brutal role within the organization. According to multiple accounts, during the time Rosenberg was active, he was the one who consistently inflicted the final grisly act of violence on victims, stabbing them after they had already been shot in the head. Witnesses also described a disturbing ritual. Rosenberg often carried out these stabbings and subsequent dismemberments clad only in his underwear or boxer shorts. This unsettling choice was reportedly a calculated effort to avoid staining the expensive designer clothing he favored. The crew's victims met their grisly ends for various reasons, primarily tied to law enforcement cooperation or disputes within the drug trade, a world Rosenberg had fully immersed himself in by the mid to late 1970s. Some bodies were left at the scene of the murders, while others were dumped in nearby locations to conceal the crimes. One victim, Kevin Gwelly, had been given cocaine by Rosenberg to sell off to customers Gwelly claimed he had available. When Rosenberg demanded payment shortly after giving him the drugs to sell, Gwelly claimed someone had robbed his house and stolen the product. Rosenberg allegedly shot him dead on the spot. Another man was found shot to death and dumped into the trunk of a car, allegedly after attempting to rip Rosenberg off in a marijuana deal. By the late 1970s, Rosenberg had firmly established himself in the underworld, benefiting from both his ongoing activities in the drug trade and his collaboration with the notorious DeMeo crew. His illicit dealings had afforded him a lavish lifestyle, allowing him to reside in an upscale neighborhood where, when not managing his criminal enterprises, he spent his spare time pursuing a private pilot's license. A man of many ventures, Rosenberg owned several businesses, including a pizzeria and a body shop, all while being deeply immersed in the high-stakes world of drug trafficking. He was responsible for smuggling vast quantities of marijuana from Colombia, as well as distributing large amounts of cocaine. In his position as Roy DeMeo's right-hand man, Rosenberg sometimes assumed the alias Chris DeMeo during drug transactions, a name that reflected the deep bond he had formed with DeMeo, who had come to serve as a surrogate father figure in Rosenberg's life. In 1979, Rosenberg traveled to Florida to broker a major cocaine deal with a loan shark client of Roy DeMeo's, a man named Charles Padnick. Padnick had recently entered the drug trade, attempting to settle mounting debts, and was well connected to a Cuban individual named William Serrano. Serrano had ties to two Cuban drug dealers, Pepon and El Negro, and was informed by Padnick of an Italian group looking to purchase a substantial shipment of cocaine. After meeting with Rosenberg, who introduced himself as Chris DeMeo, Serrano informed his associates of the deal, and a plan was set into motion. However, Rosenberg was never made aware of the true origin of the drugs involved. Serrano, Padnick, and others flew to New York to finalize the transaction, but within hours of their arrival, they were brutally executed, dismembered, and disposed of by Rosenberg and other members of the DeMeo crew. That same night, Rosenberg was treated at a hospital for gunshot wounds to his hand and head, leading many to speculate that the Cuban group may have attempted to resist before being overpowered and killed. When El Negro didn't hear from his relatives, he grew concerned and contacted Padnick's son Jamie seeking answers. Soon after, Jamie Padnick flew to New York, only to meet the same gruesome fate as the others, disappearing without a trace. Rosenberg and his crew left a chilling mark of violence as Jamie Padnick was also murdered and dismembered, a grim testament to the lethal consequences of crossing the DeMeo crew. The only information available about the situation involving the Cubans was the name Chris DeMeo, and the general location of New York City. This limited information led to a series of inquiries by the Cubans' contacts in the city, eventually connecting the situation to Roy DeMeo and the powerful Gambino family. In 1983, Dominic Montiglio, the nephew of DeMeo's superior, Anthony Gaggi, turned government witness. He revealed that he was tasked with delivering messages between the Cubans' contact in New York and the Gambino family. According to Montiglio, a Cuban informant known as El Negro insisted that the only way to resolve the conflict was through the murder of Chris Rosenberg, making it clear that the hit would need to be highly publicized. The Cubans' reasoning was that if Rosenberg's death didn't make the headlines, no one would believe it had truly happened. Despite the clear directive to kill Rosenberg, DeMeo stalled for weeks, reportedly due to his close relationship with the target. This delay frustrated the Cuban drug lord, who sent a team of enforcers to New York to ensure the hit was carried out soon, threatening violent consequences if the murder wasn't completed. Amid this escalating tension, DeMeo committed what would become his most infamous murder. Mistaking an innocent man for a Cuban hitman, he killed Dominic Rigucci, a 19-year-old college student who was selling vacuum cleaners door-to-door to pay for his education. When DeMeo saw Rigucci's car parked outside his house, he assumed the young man was there as part of a plot to kill him. DeMeo pursued Rigucci in a high-speed car chase, which ended tragically when Rigucci was shot and killed after his car was damaged beyond repair. This act of mistaken identity caused a significant stir, and DeMeo's superior, Anthony Gaggi, soon intervened. He confronted DeMeo, ordering him to end his delays and eliminate Rosenberg before any more innocent lives were lost in the process. Rosenberg was reportedly never informed about the Cuban situation, and thus had no indication that his life was in danger. On May 11, 1979, he went to the regular nightly meeting with DeMeo and crew. As he sat at the table with his associates, DeMeo pulled a pistol out of a brown bag sitting on the table and shot Rosenberg in the head, wounding but not killing him. When Rosenberg got up off the floor and stumbled onto one knee, Anthony Center stood and shot him 4 more times in the head. Rosenberg's body was then placed in his car, which was driven and left parked on a street near the Gateway National Recreation Area in New York City. Crew member Frederick Dynome then drove by the vehicle while Henry Borelli raked it with machine gun fire to ensure the murder was a blatant enough assassination to guarantee that it would be mentioned in the local newspaper. This gave the Cubans proof of the killing and diffused the situation. Witnesses claimed that for years afterward, DeMeo expressed genuine regret at having to kill Rosenberg. Members of the DeMeo crew were suspects in Rosenberg's murder, but there was not enough evidence to charge them. Years later, however, the murder would be among many other charges in a 1984 indictment against the surviving crew members, after cooperating witnesses for the government provided a great deal of information on the crew's activities. At the trial in 1988, testimony was given by Dominic Montiglio and Vito Arena, linking the remnants of the DeMeo crew with Rosenberg's murder. In 1989, the defendants were convicted of all charges, and Joseph Testa and Anthony Center, the only core DeMeo crew members who had not been murdered or already imprisoned, were sentenced to life in prison. Rosenberg was a significant figure within the Roy DeMeo crew, which operated under the Gambino crime family in New York during the 1970s and 1980s. Known for his cold, calculating demeanor, Rosenberg played a key role in the crew's illicit operations, which ranged from racketeering and loan sharking to involvement in several notorious murders. Rosenberg's main impact on the American Mafia stemmed from his role in the crew's brutal activities, particularly their involvement in murder for hire. The DeMeo crew was notorious for its high body count, and Rosenberg, like many of his associates, was responsible for carrying out killings. The crew is believed to have been responsible for over 100 murders, many of which were carried out with extreme efficiency and secrecy. Rosenberg's legacy within the Mafia is a complex one. While he was known to be a loyal enforcer for the DeMeo crew, his violent actions and ability to operate within the shadows contributed to the Mafia's fearsome reputation in the criminal underworld. However, with the eventual dismantling of the DeMeo crew and the subsequent convictions of several members, Rosenberg's impact became more of a reminder of the dangers associated with organized crime and the fleeting nature of power within the Mafia. His role in these operations contributed to the crew's legacy as one of the most lethal in Mafia history.